Awesome. And we should, start seeing folks kind of trickle in now. Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome, welcome. Oh, let me share my screen so you know that you're all in the right place. Wonderful. So as we give people a moment to make their way into this webinar, I would love to do a quick audio visual check. So if you could write into the chat, let us know if you can hear and see us okay. That would be very appreciated. We want to make sure we're not, just kind of moving mouths, Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. So it does usually take a minute or two for everyone to kind of make their way in. So I want to take a moment and thank you, everyone. I'd love to hear where you all are tuning in from. So we're here in Providence, Rhode Island. So where are you all kind of joining us from today? Wow, Egypt, India, Princeton, New Jersey. Hey, Boston. Awesome. Not too far. Kuwait, a little further. Wow. Awesome. We have a really kind of diverse group of folks from all different places, especially lots of different countries. That's fantastic. But it's great to see people all over from the US as well. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. So let me see. It looks like we're just okay. I think we're at a good spot to maybe get started, just to make sure we have plenty of time for presentations and to ask questions, of course, as well. So I'm going to just stop sharing so you can see our who we're talking to. I'll quickly introduce myself. Hi, I'm Isabel Sanchez. I'm an admissions officer at RISD, but I would love to pass it over to my colleague who will be, really the main kind of, hopefully I will be talking less and it will be, mainly my colleague here.
Thank you, Isabel, and hi everyone. It's really great to see such a diverse group of students assembled. And my name is Amy Kulper. I'm the head of the architecture department. This is my 5th year in that role and my 5th year at RISD. And it's really a delight to meet you all and tell you a little bit about what we do in the architecture department at RISD. So Isabel, should I go ahead and share my slides or?
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to start sharing your screen, I'll just kind of give, just make one mention that I'll be in the background answering questions and certainly saving some to ask Amy directly at the end of her presentation. So feel free to submit questions throughout the whole presentation through the Q&A. And yeah, we'll kind of switch back over. I'll turn my mic and my camera back on once we have time for Q&A. But yep, you're all set. Take it away, Amy.
Great. Thanks so much, Isabel. So hi, everyone. I wanted to start by showing you the students call this the BEB, the Bayard Ewing Building, which is where the architecture department is located on the 1st, 3rd, and 4th floors, and the landscape architecture department is located on the 2nd floor. So the BEB is a beautiful 19th century mill building that sits right on the river. And so you're seeing the Main Street side, but on the other side, our studios overlook the river, and it's pretty scenic, and we are all really excited to be back in person in the building. And I was saying to Isabel as we met earlier that it's really palpable, the excitement of being back in person with our students, and that's been a great start to the academic year. So first, I just wanted to start with some questions that I imagine many of you might be asking yourselves, which is, if I, what major might I consider when I'm at RISD? And in particular today, I'm going to talk about why architecture. And so typically early kind of foundational work in most colleges of the arts are dealing with manipulation of two-dimensional and three-dimensional thinking. And this is one of the things that is really critical foundational skills to future architectural practice. And so I would say that if you find yourself really interested in these transformations from 2D to 3D, and then in particular in thinking through models and thinking through what spatially might be intriguing, then it could be that architecture is a good major selection for you. So I thought it might help you all to imagine what your first semester at RISD architecture would look like. We are a department of about 150 undergraduates, about 100 graduate students. And so our undergraduates come through a 5-year BArch program. Our graduates through a 3-year MArch program. And I think it might be helpful to just say, what's that first semester out of foundations and into architecture look like? It starts with a course, a core studio that we call the Making of Design Principles. And so here I just want to show you the kinds of things that our students are working on. So in their EFS year, in their year in experimental foundation studies, they are working on different techniques for drawing, but as they enter into architecture, you can really see the kind of discipline of architecture in the kinds of drawings that students are doing. So they're trying to start with real abstractions, as you'll see here, of space in plan and section, and to really try to understand through these techniques of how to draw architectural space that's cut through as a plan or a section, what kinds of spatialities they might be producing, and but still with a high degree of abstraction that's related to what students might have understood and worked through, what skills they might have worked through previously in their foundations training. So an important part of these drawings, which look very similar, is that a big part of architectural education is about iterative making. And so students in their first semester in our department will do sequences of drawings and simultaneously sequences of models to try to work through a spatial idea. In this case, a kind of layered a kind of layered space, and what's the consequences of introducing a intersecting volume into an otherwise layered space. And so the important part of this work is to work back and forth to understand what can be communicated in plan best, what can be communicated in section best, what can be communicated in model best. And there are some students who come into our program who are very much committed to model making and know much less about drawing, and vice versa. Some students who really can draw and really know the conventions of architectural drawing. And so in that first semester, they start to really skill up in their making of 3D models. So I'm showing you one student's work in the Making of Design Principles over the semester, and the ways in which they moved from a pretty crude prototype model to something that's becoming spatially pretty provocative and sophisticated. And then now they're moving back to drawing. Now that they've really fully articulated this idea and model, they're trying to understand, well, what are the implications of that again as I draw the building and the space and how people might experience it. And so some really basic geometric drawings that as you saw, the models became quite complex. And now part of the practice as the students translate and work back and forth is to really think about how many of those details are necessary, what degree of abstraction does the space require, etc. And so these drawings are starting to work through some of those ideas about how much complexity is enough, how much complexity is too much. And then those, as you saw, those drawings and models worked back and forth in dialogue with one another. But towards the end of the first semester, we introduce a site, and in particular, a topography. So students are then starting to understand that they thought of their project being on a kind of flat plane, but now they're trying to grapple with the role that the site might make in the articulation of this originally abstract idea that is now is materializing in more specific ways and manifesting itself on the site. And so students do this also by trying to understand how they might excavate into the site and how people might experience moving below and above the horizon line, what that space might be like, what it is to be above that space, what it's like to feel like you're in the ground, like the work is subterranean. And then to try to really understand what's the roofscape in relationship to that ground, how will the building be experienced by people outside of it on the site. And so again, you see this moving back and forth where even the site is modeled in a kind of striated way, like the language of the architecture, to try to understand where the two can come together by the students, and to try to understand, well, what are the subtle manipulations in of the section of the building, and how will that allow for different kinds of spaces throughout. So now that that's been worked out in model, in a site model, the student then returns to plans and sections to really try, now that the volumes intersected with an actual site, to really try to understand how is this inhabitable, and what are the kind of particular experiences, how would people live, how would they occupy the space, how would they see out of the space, how would they arrive onto the space. And then typically from those very early iterative studies, something like this, like a more finished model, helps the student to work through what the kind of bigger ideas of the project were in relation to some more finished drawings, and to understand in this case, the modulation of the roofscape of this project and how it might become topography like. It becomes sort of like the site that the building sits on. And so this success of making, as you can see in each iteration, becomes increasingly refined. So now the students really returning to the plans of the building in a much more precise way, and trying to understand, if you're on this hilly site, as you occupy the space, how do you occupy the space, and how do you look out onto the landscape beyond, and what's the experience of being in that space. So working now in conjunction with the plan and the perspectival views to really understand what it feels like to occupy that space at different times of day, and more as an abstraction, what does it feel like to move through that space without all of those signs of kind of human occupancy. So students then try to understand, because they've been working iteratively, and because they've been working between two-dimensional and three-dimensional models, then they try to really understand, well, how do we bring all of this understanding about the building together? And so typically in that first year, we work through some composite drawings like this, where they are able to bring different perspectival and plan and even axonometric views together, and down here some sectional views together, so that they're really able to communicate on one board all of their kind of spatial thinking around a project. So that's one student's journey through the first sophomore studio that they would take in architecture, the making of design principles. And so next, I am imagining that you are wondering, what other studio courses will you take in your first semester? And the other course is a drawing course, a representation course called Projection. And so the idea behind projection is, as you can see from the examples of drawing, there is a real discipline to architectural drawing. And so projection is there for students to really learn the conventions of architectural drawing, while in studio they are trying to understand how to work through to represent their ideas using those conventions. So I want to show you this project that the projection students do, which is really about the tools on their desks and how they are used. And they all produce a kind of animation like this one. So here, the idea is that they're understanding both that they are making a drawing, but they are looking at themselves planimetrically. They're looking at themselves and their work like a plan, and they're understanding the working table and the tools as being the key constituents of this drawing. And so this exercise is done to allow them to start to understand the conventions of planimetric drawing, what it means to cut something and see it from above, but also to understand the issue of occupancy. Like, we're not just making these drawings in the abstract, we're making these drawings for spaces that students actually occupy. And so all of the students did this drawing working in partners and filmed each other from above in order to give a sense of how this representation, how this planimetric representation works. Again, the work in the first semester is iterative. And so this exercise, the same exercise, asked students to then back away from the animations that they made of their drawing and to sort of storyboard the drawing and understand what they were drawing in a series of abstractions. Then to the recombination of those frames, no longer planimetrically, but sectionally, to try to understand how the actual process of drawing can be generative in the imagination of an architectural space. Back down to the tools on the table, but here in a much more abstract iteration of the drawing that contemplates the movement of the tools across the page as the drawing gets constructed. And then a zoomed way out view of the process where we're trying to help students understand diagrammatically how to come to terms with their own process. So kind of stepping away from the process and saying, first I made the animation, here's what it produced. When I tried to think about it sectionally, it produced these things, etc. So a kind of zooming out to understand the larger process and what it might be productive of. And then, just like we did in the Making of Design Principles studio, the projection studio will also work on your skills of working between two-dimensional and three-dimensional production and trying to understand material translation. So here, understanding the relationship of materials and form, understanding the qualities of those materials when they are lit differently, what kinds of effects they produce, then translating those materials into a different formal expression. So basically, different materials, same form, but different affordances of those materials, because now a different level of detail can be added to the form. Now a combination of the two. And now zooming out to a larger model to try to understand what the manipulation of plan and section has yielded spatially for the student. So manipulating that form to try to understand what it could be as built form as they move through this exercise, documenting that. Back out to the diagram. So now, once again, diagramming the process and trying to understand in each phase what pieces were the constituent pieces and what forms were produced from that. And then back to some greater abstraction. So you can see there is a real consistency in the way that students zoom in and zoom out of projects, moving from abstraction to something more concrete like material in the projection studio, or more concrete like a site in the Making of Design Principles studio. Now backing out into another form of abstraction, this time with color, to try to understand how color can create depth in some of these abstractions. And then finally, you're seeing one student's projection work on the wall together at the end of the studio. And we this crazy model with a big fly on it that shows you where they landed formally in this exploration. I'm imagining that as we come out of the pandemic, that many of you are curious about travel opportunities at RISD Architecture, and we think it's really essential to the education of the architect that you travel, that you visit a lot of cities, that you take in different urbanisms and different experiences. And so in the past, we have traveled. This is a studio that Ann Tate took to Malmo, Sweden. Malmo is a sister city to Providence. It's roughly the same size as Providence. It sits on a harbor. It has many of the same environmental issues at stake. And so Ann and her students were really visiting that city to try to understand issues around sustainability that they could bring back to Providence and to their design work here. This is Hansi Better pictured in the middle, and a studio that she took students to Mexico. You can see a student in a pink sweatshirt photographing a Luis Barragan building. This is Emmanuel Edmasu's studio that went to Dar es Salaam and Zanzibar. And then we do more local travel as well. So we 2 years ago started a departmental equitable travel fund, and we are able to fully finance our third semester undergraduates and our third semester graduates to do a kind of more local travel. And so in this case, Hansi and Emmanuel took their students to Atlanta, Georgia, and they looked at issues around education post-segregation in Georgia. So they met, you're seeing on the right, they met with community leaders, and they really talked through what it means to design a school in that context today. And it's really exciting because that work, Emmanuel's was featured in the MoMA exhibition, Reconstructions, Architecture, and Blackness in America, in which 10 Black architects from across the US were selected to share their work and their ruminations on a single city. And Emmanuel did his work on Atlanta, and so was really informed by the work that he and Hansi did with students in Atlanta the previous semester. Here's a question that I think is maybe one of the most important questions in my mind of this presentation is: how has RISD Architecture responded to student activism related to the Black Lives Matter movement? And we've done this in many ways, and this is something maybe we could tease out in the conversation to follow. But first, we did this through a series of conversations called Race and. So Race and Art and Race and Urbanism were the first two installations in that series. In Race and Art, two architects/artists, Mitchell Squire and Jennifer Newsom, whose practices sit somewhere between the fine arts and architecture, talked about how they deal with the issue of identity as architects, which is something that we expect of fine artists, and increasingly and importantly are coming to expect of architects. And then Garnett Cadigan and Elgin Cleckley joined us, two architects and urbanists who are both thinking about walking, what it means to walk through the city as a Black man, and shared their essays. The students all read the essays, and then a beautiful conversation with them around this issue of areas of inclusion and exclusion that we experience in cities and how critical they are to understand to the architect. And we've done this through our lecture series. So I'm showing you past lecture series, but I want to tell you about what we have coming up in the spring, and hope that you might be able to join us in your visits to RISD. We are doing an amazing lecture series on design for the global diaspora. And so our first speaker will be Leslie Loco from the African Futures Institute. And we'll have Mariam Kamara, Sean Anderson. It's a kind of an amazing group of architects thinking around this issue of the global diaspora. And so we'll share those with you and hope that you can join us for those. We're also thinking about this question through the required history curriculum in the department. So students, undergraduates are required to take two history courses, modern architecture and world architecture. In modern architecture, we actually purchased this book for all of our sophomores and first year grad students. I taught this version of the course with Indigenous architect and scholar Summer Sutton. This year, those courses are being taught by RISD's SEI fellow Herman Payeras and Malcolm Rio. And so it's a real attempt to decolonize our canon and to really understand the many roles that race has played in the conceptualization of modern architecture. Additionally, we've had special advanced studios that are designated as SEI advanced studios. So with Summer Sutton, the Indigenous architect I just mentioned, and Ajay Manthripragada, who did something on, he was looking at precedents from the global South and having students design a tall building in New York City. Summer's studio had to do with the repatriation of Native artifacts, and they were designing a museum of absence. So this is a pretty consistent feature in our advanced studios. And if you are interested in social justice, as I hope you are, I think you'll find a kind of robust offering in that area in our department. Additionally, we had Jess Myers, who did a studio called Other Modes, that really looked at different ways that architects can practice. And Jay Shin and Damon Rich, who did a studio based on the Green New Deal called Green New Donuts. So we try to both have a kind of offering of advanced studios that are about racial justice, but also about environmental justice and their intersectionality. And these are just a few of the examples. It's important to note that RISD just did a cluster of 10 hires of new professors across the disciplines at RISD who are expert in issues of social justice in their field. And we were fortunate enough to hire 2 of them in our department. So Jess Myers, pictured here, is one, and Jacqueline Shaw is the other. And so those are the things, those are the ways we are thinking around issues of social justice and the role that architects might play in those. From that to maybe a more mundane concern that you all might have, which is what would my home space look like at RISD architecture? So in our department, every student is assigned their own space in the BEB, the Bayard Ewing building that I showed you at the beginning of this presentation. And I'm showing you an image on the left of what this space looks like at the end of the semester, which is that it's full of models and drawings and materials and amazing ideas. And what it looks like in the beginning of the semester, this is the 4th floor on the right where our thesis students sit. And it only looks about like that for about a day before everyone gets moved in. But you can see it's quite a beautiful space, and it gives students really an opportunity to share their work with each other. and to really, really be able to engage in studio culture and the benefits of studio culture, which of course the biggest benefit is peer-to-peer learning, really understanding like how'd you do that with your model, or how did you make that thing happen in your drawing with Rhino, etc. So if the early studio images that I was sharing with you were of the core, the 3 semesters of the undergraduate core, I imagine the other thing that you're wondering is what are your options for studios after you complete the core? And I'm showing you this image because I think it really shows you the kind of range of things that students might be up to in our department. And I think that RISD architecture really benefits from being a Department of Architecture in a College of the Arts, in that our students are medium agile, and that's really what we want them to be. And so they're really doing explorations from like these. This was a studio that Jonathan Knowles taught, in which students were really trying to understand through incredibly large scale models the kind of tectonics of a building project that they were designing. To these were some of the projects from Ajay Manthripragada's SEI studio, where the models above are the specific models that students did in relation to a precedent from the global South that they were trying to learn from. And then I'm going to call them models, the digital models below are their translation of those ideas into a skyscraper in Manhattan, and how they thought through those kind of borrowings from that precedent. This is I'm going to play this animation. This is a studio, an advanced studio by Laura Peterson called the Parts Studio, in which students were asked to design a kind of kit of parts that from which they would design a kind of spatial intervention. And all of the students at the end produced a series of animations in relation to these parts. And the studio also produced a book, which was a kind of catalog of architectural parts, which was really fun. It was a really fun review to be a part of, and to really think through how they were using animation in relation to their thinking about their architecture. This is an advanced studio called Color Space, offered by Yasmin Vobis. Yasmin had just come off of winning the Rome Prize, where she'd spent a year in Rome at the American Academy doing these scans of historic architecture, and really looking at the way these scans might produce, these 3D scans might produce color space. So basically the students learned the techniques of digitally scanning buildings, and then they produced, they worked in tandem with RISD's Color Lab, and they produced these schemes that were based on their digital scanning of buildings and also their experimentations with color in the Color Lab. So this is the work of an advanced studio taught by our graduate program director, Carl Estrito. And this studio and Carl's work is really interested in the role that digital image, computational image making can play in the way that we as architects think about space. And so the work that students did there was really to start to use certain kinds of animation techniques to rethink architectural form, essentially. So that's the beginning and the middle of an architectural education at RISD. But many of you may still be wondering, well, how does the BArch degree conclude? And I can tell you that it concludes pretty excitingly with thesis. So this year we have 8 thesis and directed research cohorts in which students lead a self-directed year-long project, which is an inquiry into some of the things that they are curious about. So this is one of my students, Zach Schumacher, whose project he called Digital Duck. And he was looking at this process that you see on the right of hydra dipping, where he was interested in the digital misrepresentation of pattern onto form. And he wanted to produce that in both analog and digital ways. Here he produced this drawing of the house that has been in his family for multiple generations, but including the hands of the hydra dipper and trying to understand how to transform that space digitally. This is a project, a directed research studio project done with Daniel Ibanez, and this was looking at the student was really interested in reoccupying an oil rig and trying to understand that as a kind of new spatial, futuristic spatial proposition. So I think you can see that that those are pretty disparate visions of what one could do at RISD, and that's something we really want in the thesis. Like, we pride ourselves on it being student-led inquiries into their own spatial curiosities. So what did we do when we were interrupted by the pandemic? We produced a book. So students who were not able to actually physically present their work because we had gone remote due to the pandemic had their work featured in these spreads for this book. We just had a launch for the book. It was published by Actar, the Barcelona-based publisher that does beautiful graphic books. It was designed by James Goggin, RISD graphic design faculty member, and he basically consulted with the students to say, there's a basic layout, but I want to know your vision for the layout of your work. And so each spread that you see is the student working with James to realize their project in publication. So everyone who graduated is also a published architect. And to really lay out the work in a way where they're able to give the kind of 4-page elevator pitch spread of their thesis work. And so we're really excited about this book, and we're just sending it out to those students now, but hope to continue that it was such a kind of important practice for us. And we hope to continue that so that we're able to offer that option in the future to students, because it really gave us a good sense of what was being produced in our thesis and directed research studios. Sorry, one other thing to say about this book is at the end of the book, all of the kind of luminaries who participated on the final review of the thesis actually wrote either essays or interviews in which they cited the students' work in their conversation of what was going on now in architectural education. And so not only the students have their work published, but they have their work published oftentimes with commentary by very important people in our field. And that part was really exciting as well. And Actar published for each student the 4-page, they get 5 copies of the 4-page spread of their work. So if you come see us, we can share the actual physical book with you. What's a successful graduate of RISD architecture look like? To me, I hope the answer is the same as what the thesis work looks like, which is it looks like each individual that does the thesis work. So it looks like Gabrielle Bullock, who is now a member of of RISD's Board of Trustees, but also the Principal Director of Global Diversity at her firm. And I think, you know, a real advocate and supporter of the work of social justice that we're doing in the department. It can also look like Michael Maltzson and Amy Murphy. The building on the left is a project recently completed by Michael Maltzin, whereas Amy is just finishing her PhD in film, and she is doing exhibitions like the image on the right that look at the intersections of architecture and film, architecture and cinema. It could be like Anthony Achavati, who, when he finished his BArch degree, went on a Fulbright to map the Ganges River, which then turned into a book project, which is what you are looking at here, and a kind of future intellectual project. Or it could look like Rafael de Cardenas, who is really, I would say, a profoundly interdisciplinary designer. So he is designing architectures, interiors, objects, books. And so that's another kind of skill set that we think that RISD architecture students or alumni have in their arsenal when they leave our department. So if you're leaning towards architecture as your major, but you're not sure, what should you do? I think you should reach out to us. I think you should do your kind of due diligence and really look around. There are some amazing departments at RISD, and these conversations are not at all proprietary. All your faculty really want you to be in the major that you're going to find really fulfilling. So feel free to check our website. Feel free to contact us through this email, ArchDept, with any of your questions, and we will get back to you as quickly as we can. I just wanted to finish with a couple of images. RISD has a kind of amazing feature, which is that during the winter session, we have experimental student-taught courses during the winter session. And I just want to show you work produced in 3 of those. So this was a studio run by Julie Kress last winter, and giving you some sense of the kind of digital animation work that she was able to work with students from across the disciplines at RISD on. And this was a course offered by Zach Schumacher and Eamon Wagner, where they were looking at still life as a kind of form with students, but also trying to understand how to architecturalize them. And it produced just beautiful constructions like this one. So I think that's where maybe my presentation ends, and maybe where your hopefully where your questions begin. I'm happy to answer any thoughts or questions that you have. And thank goodness Isabel is back.
Yeah, no, definitely some great questions coming in. Thank you for your presentation. I know I learned a lot and really loved looking at the student work. So that was fantastic for me. I hope you all enjoyed it as well. Yes, so we do have some great questions coming in, and even more now that I think people are taking a moment to type their questions in. So I think some of the first questions will talk about or are definitely coming from people thinking ahead to being an architecture major, being an architect. So how important do you feel math skills are in succeeding in interior architecture or architecture, maybe specifically at RISD and maybe in general as well? Yeah, some people are wondering,
It's the perennial question. Yeah, it's the perennial question. And I can answer that question by saying that we have an amazing faculty in building technology. And I've taught at a bunch of other schools of architecture, so I can also say a pretty rare one. So the person that really formulated much of our the kind of math part of our building technology sequence is a guy called Brett Schneider, who did his undergraduate in studio arts and then became an engineer. And he has shaped the curriculum around the idea of empirical observation. Like if we can look at the world and understand like what's making that bush outside of my window stand up, that we can understand the mathematical skills required to become an architect. So the one thing I would say is that it's not mathematics in abstraction, it's mathematics in application. And so it's so much easier if you're trying to understand like how far over does that floor have to cantilever so that the building will stand up. That's a much easier and concrete question to ask than just, can I do physics in the abstract, which nobody wants to do, I think. And so I would say that math is important, but we also understand that many people who come into architecture do it because they have amazing spatial imaginations, and we want to scaffold that experience for you. And I think people like Brett have designed a curriculum that takes those of you who feel anxious in the face of math and makes you feel kind of in control of that, and makes you feel like I can do this thing because it's really about the thing I love, which is designing cool spaces. And I can understand the concrete applications of like how math helps me understand certain design things. And that's a really different skill set than what you learned in whatever the last math course you took was. And I think that's the really important thing to remember, is that when you're trying to study for application, it's really different than just studying math because you have to.
Absolutely. Thank you. And just to kind of keep with that train of thought, we have a question here. I'm just kind of read it. So this person is mentioning that, yes, generally RISD recommends that you have some background with, physics and math a little bit. But this person is mentioning that they instead took an environmental systems and societies class, not physics. Would I still be able to apply to the interior architecture major despite not taking physics? So I can speak to the first part. Keep in mind, you're not applying directly to a major when you apply to RISD as a first-year student. If you're applying as a transfer student, that's different. But if you're a first-year student, you're applying to RISD in general, you're going to start in the foundation year, declare your major at the end of your first year, and you're guaranteed a spot in whatever major you choose. So it's not a prerequisite to take physics, but yes, it's, we do generally recommend it. Maybe also, Amy, if you could kind of speak to, do you recommend students take any classes kind of thinking ahead, knowing that they want to pursue architecture?
It's a great question, Isabel. I think I think, if you are thinking ahead and there are things that you are inclined to take, for sure you should take them. If you feel math anxious, it never hurts to take an extra math course. If you feel like the history of design is really of interest to you, then taking a history of architecture class, it's always going to make you, like, the more you know about the field, the farther ahead you're going to be as you enter the field. And I think that that's really important. But I would also say that we take our responsibility seriously to fully, we prepare you for licensure to become a licensed architect. And so we need to be able to tell our accrediting body that we give you everything you need to become an architect. So we're pretty, I think we're pretty nimble at accommodating different kinds of backgrounds, helping students get up to speed if they're behind in history theory or behind in math. Everyone has kind of signature skills as a student. And so I think it's just a matter of, it's a matter of following the things that really interest you, and then knowing that we will support you with whatever of those skills you feel might be still need some strengthening.
Absolutely. Thank you. Wonderful. So I think folks are just really excited by your presentation, are like, okay, how do I get to RISD? How do I take these classes? So one question, are we expected to know how to use any certain software or programs? Will we be taught how to use specific programs? do you recommend learning any programs before attending RISD?
It's a great question. We primarily, at RISD, we primarily work in Rhino. The students primarily work in Rhino, but our curriculum is shaped so that a student who's been using Rhino for the last 5 years and a student who doesn't even know what Rhino is, both get really skilled up in the first year of the program. So what I would recommend, like, over your course of life as an architect, you will probably learn like 10 to 20 different softwares that are the software of that period. What's more important is procedural literacy. It's like knowing how to know a software. And so I think students often panic and say, like, I'm going to take this course and this course, I'm going to learn CAD and Rhino and Maya before I even get there. And I think they underestimate how quickly as digital natives they take up a new software, but they also, it's always helpful. Like, it's always helpful to know that territory and to be familiar with that territory and be able to operate in that territory. But again, I would just answer that, like, there's no one thing you have to know before you get here. We really increasingly see digital skills as also an important part of our social equity work. Like, it allows students to practice in a multitude of contexts. And that's really important to us, that they have those skills when they leave RISD. So we take that pretty seriously in terms of helping you acquire those skills. And that's why you take both a studio and a representation course for your first 2 semesters, because we really think about how can we skill you up. And then if you're more interested, the studios like Carl Estrito's studio, where you might be coding and really understanding how to do a digital animation, etc. All of that's available to you as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. So the next question, is there a big difference between the architecture and interior architecture majors or courses?
It's a really good question. I mean, historically, the interior architecture programs, until about like 25 years ago, in this country, interior architecture programs were much more like interior decoration. And it's only in the last 25 years that they have really been geared towards interior design. So that's an important distinction to make. First off, that many students think of like picking fabric swatches, et cetera, with interior architecture. And now that it's much more about designing within existing building stock. So that's important. The second really important thing to know about interior architecture is that at RISD, that department is really inflected now towards issues of adaptive reuse. So the idea is a kind of environmental one, that we're not building new buildings, but that the work of interior architecture is to really adapt new interiors to already existing buildings. So the skill sets that you would have would be different, because in interior architecture, you're working with a kind of given circumstance of a building, and you're trying to understand how to adapt it. And in architecture, more like the early projects I was showing that we do in the first semester, you're working on a site and you're kind of building from the ground up. So that's really the fundamental difference between the two. I think, yeah, I don't know if I've answered that question, but if there's more that student is wondering, I think that's how I would at least start to answer the difference. Like, in terms of the structure of the 2 curricula, it's a similar kind of set of requirements that you would do in both, but the primary orientation is really different in the 2 programs.
Absolutely. And I do also want to mention, before I forget, that later tonight, so in an hour and a half after this webinar ends, we will be having a student panel with current RISD architecture and interior architecture students. So if you're curious about hearing from the student side of things, definitely be sure to join us. It'll be, again, like I mentioned, just an hour and a half after this webinar. So I hope to see you there. So the next question is kind of thinking ahead to after graduation. Does RISD help undergrads find employment or develop their own practice? And there was also a question similarly asking about support for internships. So I did want to, kind of speak to what RISD has overall, and then certainly want to hear from you, Amy, as well. So RISD has the Career Center, which is a phenomenal resource for all RISD students to, get more support, information. They have events all for helping you figure out what you want to do after RISD, making that happen. Of course, they have, so Artworks is a great RISD specific jobs portal, so you can find internships there, jobs there. They also have events like Internship Connect. That's actually happening on Wednesday, where a bunch of companies come to campus, and it's like a college fair, but companies, people looking for internships, kind of coming together. And I do also want to plug one more thing. So this Friday, we're going to have, as a part of this Open RISD series of events, we're going to have a webinar with the Career Center. And, Kevin Jankowski, who is, the director, he can certainly give tons of examples of how RISD can help you, find an internship or job or start your own business in architecture. So, we do have that separate office resource that is, there to help you. But, certainly, Amy, I'm also curious, maybe as a faculty, if there's any kind of, anything you'd want to mention from that point of view as well.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I loved, Isabel, about the students' question was like, okay, how do you help us with the design of our practice? And I think I just wanted to share that when in the wake of the George Floyd protests, when we were really trying to understand, like, how can architecture change in relation to all the social justice and racial justice issues going on in the world, but also climate issues, et cetera. And one of the things that we really did as a department was to pivot from the idea of the practice of design, which to us felt like that's the status quo. Like, if we just continue to practice design the way we've always practiced design, we're going to produce the same things we've always produced. And so we pivoted to really thinking through and really thinking our curriculum through the lens of the design of practice, so that students can really think about the many ways, the many modalities of practice available to an architect. So you can practice with a nonprofit, you can practice in community organization, you can practice in a cooperativized practice, you can practice as an activist, you can practice through curatorial practice, you can practice traditionally in a corporate firm, right? There's just a latitude of things that you can do with your degree. And so we're trying to think through how the best way to prepare architects now, given what's going on in the world, is that you be agile and nimble. And so that's a part of our thinking that we're really building into the curriculum from the beginning. And then with respect to the really pragmatic question of how do we get jobs? You are all required to do a professional internship. And we work with Kevin and the Career Center, and there's a kind of network available to students of many RISD alum who are placed in firms all over the world and different kinds of practices, who value RISD education and want to give those opportunities to our students. But also we work personally with students around, if they have something in particular that they really want to do, if they're thinking they want to do retail design, or we try to help them find a practice that really specializes in the kind of work that they're going to do, because oftentimes these internships that students get develop into jobs once students graduate, because the firm realizes how great our students are and they want to hire them. And so these are important placements for us, because we think of those also as helping our students get out in the world when they're finished their degrees.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we are coming up on time. So I'm going to kind of end with a question that I've seen both in the chat and in the Q&A. This is certainly seems like a popular question, something on everyone's mind. Is an undergraduate degree enough to be able to start our own practice / do we need a master's degree to practice architecture and for licensure?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're going to love the answer. No, you do not need an MArch degree. A decent percentage, I would say, probably in the range of 30% of our students will go on to do an MArch degree after they complete their BArch degree, but that's not at all a requirement. The other 70% goes on to practice, works for a firm, takes their exams, gets their licensure, and can practice as a BArch. And I think this is a really important thing. Sorry, that's my canines misbehaving. I think this is a really important thing because I know students weigh the kind of economics of taking a major that requires them to be at RISD for 5 years. And I think this is the real value to this degree path, is that you can do this in 5 years. There's not, if you think about law or medicine or any of the other professions, you're in it much longer than that. And so I think it's important to think through that relationship and licensure, and to know that you can complete your degree and practice as a licensed architect. You have to work a certain number of hours in the field and take your licensure exams, but this degree completely prepares you to do that. And when students decide to continue on, it's often because there's like some area of expertise, like they're interested in digital fabrication, or they're interested in social justice and urbanism, or and so they want to go do another degree to deepen their knowledge in some particular area of architecture. So it's not seen as a kind of deficiency, like that you have a BArch and that you need an MArch. It's seen as you're ready to be licensed and practice, but if there's something you want to specialize in, that's often how our students will use the MArch degree.
Absolutely. Awesome. So thank you so much, Amy, for all your time, for your presentation. It was so fantastic to see all of the new things happening with architecture and see the student work, even some faculty work. That's awesome. Thank you everyone for attending from all over. I appreciate you working with, the time zone differences, much appreciated. So yeah, be sure to check back in. We'll have a lot more events with faculty, student panels, all types of academic resources, all this week. Be sure to sign up, because we'll send you recordings if you're not able to attend. But yes, thank you again, Amy, and have a great rest of your evening, and everyone else, your morning or afternoon. But yeah.
Thanks, Isabel. It's great to see you, and thank you everyone for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.